Hello, students. This is Professor McDermott. Well, when Thomas Jefferson became president in 1801, sometimes historians call this the Jeffersonian Revolution, and we'll get into the reasons for that shortly. But first, it really wasn't a foregone conclusion that Jefferson would actually become president. I left you with that little cliffhanger in the last lecture because of the way the Constitution was worded at that time. Jefferson actually tied with his own vice presidential running mate, Aaron Burr, in terms of the electoral votes. And so the election went into the House of Representatives. Now, you would expect at this point that Burr might have just pulled out, and said, look, this was all a mistake. Jefferson chose me to be vice president. I wasn't supposed to be president. So please just elect Jefferson. But that is not what Aaron Burr did. Aaron Burr was a very ambitious individual and convinced of his own greatness, and he saw an opportunity to sneak into the White House through the back door, if you will, and he wasn't going to lose that. And so he stayed in the race, and furthermore, a lot of the Federalist congressmen supported Burr because they hated Jefferson so much. And so actually the vote in the House of Representatives was deadlocked, and the House voted 33 times, and it was a tie each time between Jefferson and Burr. Finally, on ballot number 34, two of the representatives changed their votes, and finally Thomas Jefferson got what he deserved all along, the presidency. And fortunately, a constitutional amendment, the 12th Amendment, was ratified in 1804, changing the way the electoral votes were counted and making sure that the presidential and vice presidential votes were counted separately so that this could never happen again. Now, Burr, of course, knew that his name was mud with Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson wasn't going to put him on the ticket again when he ran for re-election in 1804, so Burr knew that he had to think about getting another job. And so in 1804, Burr decided to run for the office of governor of New York State. Now, the head of the Federalist Party was still Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton happened to live in New York City and was a very important political leader in that state. And when Burr announced his candidacy for the governorship, Hamilton said something. We don't know exactly what it was that Hamilton said about Burr. Probably that Burr was very ambitious and very dangerous and wanted to make himself the king or the emperor or something like that. We don't know what it was, but Burr was deeply offended by something that Hamilton had said about him. And in those days, when one gentleman said something insulting or offensive to another gentleman, according to the code of honor at that time, the one who was insulted had to challenge the one who insulted him to a duel in order to get his honor back. That was the code of conduct for gentlemen at that time, the code of honor. And so a duel meaning a fight to the death, usually with pistols, although sometimes you could use other weapons like swords. So anyway, Aaron Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel. Now, Hamilton really did not want to fight a duel with Burr, mainly because Hamilton's oldest son, who he loved very much, had just been killed in a duel very recently, and Hamilton was grief-stricken, and he hated dueling, and he really didn't want to do it. But again, according to the code of conduct at that time, if he had refused to fight Burr, people would have said he was a coward, and that would have been the end of his political career. He wouldn't have been able to hold up his head in public. And so reluctantly, Hamilton agreed to the duel. And so one morning in July 1804, Burr and Hamilton got into a boat and traveled across the Hudson River to the cliffs of Weehawken, New Jersey. And there, in that secluded place, they had their duel with pistols. Now, you may have seen this in old movies, but the way that the duel worked, first of all, there was a coin toss to see who would get to fire first. And in this case, Hamilton won the toss, so he actually got the first shot. And so Hamilton and Burr stood back to back with their pistols, and they marched off 10 paces, 10 steps away from each other, and then they turned, and Hamilton got to fire first. Now, one eyewitness to the duel said that Hamilton pointed his gun straight up in the air and fired into the air so that Burr would not be hit. And at that point, Burr could have just done the same thing, and the duel would have been over, and honor would have been satisfied, and both men could have gone home. But that is not what Aaron Burr did. He turned, aimed at Hamilton, and calmly, cold-bloodedly shot him in the abdomen. And instantly, Hamilton said, "This is a mortal wound." In other words, he knew he was going to die. And so Hamilton was taken back on the boat across the Hudson, back to his home with his hysterical wife and his several children, none of whom had any idea what was going on. They had not been informed about the duel. And so about 24 hours later, Hamilton died in agony. Now, this was an extraordinary event. Okay, I shouldn't laugh, but I mean, it was just such a strange and extraordinary event. Because what you have here is the actual sitting vice president of the United States killing the head of the other political party. You know, I mean, it would be like if Mike Pence shot Joe Biden. You know, I mean, it was a strange and stunning event, and it led to a lot of discussion about dueling. And in a lot of places, laws were passed against dueling as a result of Hamilton's death. But Burr knew that in the South, dueling was widely accepted. In fact, was very popular in that region. And so he decided to just go down south for a while and lay low with some friends until the whole controversy blew over. And so Burr was never indicted. He was never charged with the death of Hamilton. And then a couple of years later, he got himself into another predicament. He went out west, what was then the West, in the Mississippi Valley, you know, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Kentucky, that region. And he started to raise an army of supporters. And we still don't know exactly what Burr really had in mind to do with this private army that he was building up. Probably trying to separate the western part of the country from the eastern half and make himself the ruler of it, most likely. Well, anyway, news of this got back to Washington, D.C., and so marshals were sent to arrest Burr. They brought him back to Washington, and he was put on trial for treason. The judge in the trial was the Chief Justice, John Marshall, and what do you know? In Burr's trial, he was found not guilty, acquitted. And so he went back to New York City. He became a very successful and prosperous lawyer. And many years later, when he was in his 80s, Aaron Burr died peacefully in his own bed, never having paid the price for any of the things that he had done. So he's a really fascinating kind of arch-villain figure almost in early American history, Aaron Burr. All right, so what was revolutionary about Thomas Jefferson's takeover of power? Well, for one thing, it was the first time in American history that power was transferred from one party to another party peacefully. So the Federalists went out and the Republicans came in under Jefferson. And that set a precedent for future elections, because when your side loses in a presidential election, basically you're just supposed to accept that, even if you don't like the decision, and just peacefully allow your opponents to take over without starting a revolution or anything like that. And so the Jefferson administration set an important precedent in that regard. And when Jefferson made his first inaugural speech, it sounded like he was trying to make peace with the Federalist Party. In the speech, he said, quote, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists," end quote. In other words, basically saying, it doesn't matter what party you belong to, we're all Americans, we all want the same things, we should work together. However, in private, Jefferson was singing a very different tune. In 1802, he wrote a letter to a friend in which he said, quote, "I shall sink federalism into an abyss," that's a very deep hole, by the way, "from which there shall be no resurrection for it," end quote. In other words, he was going to drive a stake into the heart of the Federalist Party, and he was going to put an end to it forever. And Jefferson did manage to change, to some extent, how the government worked, and was able to overturn some of the policies and procedures the Federalists had put into place. So, for example, Jefferson, believing in small government, didn't want a huge military, and so he cut the military budget in half and reduced the size of the army. And then with the money that he saved from that and other things, he was able to pay off about half of the national debt that Hamilton had embraced. Because, again, unlike Hamilton, Jefferson didn't believe in a high national debt. He didn't believe in high taxes to pay off debt. And so he also repealed a lot of the taxes that Hamilton had created, especially the hated tax on whiskey that had caused the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. However, Jefferson did not succeed in changing all of the institutions that the Federalists had set up. For example, the Bank of the United States continued to exist. It had become a very important part of the financial system. Also, there was still one branch of government that was dominated by the Federalists. So the executive branch was Republican under Jefferson. The legislature, Congress, was mostly Republican. But the third branch, which, as you know, is the judiciary branch, consisted of judges that had been appointed by Washington and Adams, who were nearly all Federalists. And so the Federalist judges waged war, if you will, against the other two branches in the government, and tried in any way that they could to prevent Jefferson from changing all of the Federalist policies. And a very important new weapon in that battle was created in 1803 by Chief Justice John Marshall of Virginia. In his decision in the case Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall announced that a part of the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional. It went against the Constitution, and therefore he, John Marshall, was striking down that provision in the Act and saying that it was not a law anymore. He was canceling that law, striking it down. And this was basically the first time that the principle of judicial review was ever used in the American government. Judicial review means that the Supreme Court or lower court judges can strike down a law on the grounds that it goes against the Constitution. Now, you can look at the Constitution all day and never find one word about judicial review. It is not part of the Constitution that the Supreme Court has the power to do that. This was something that John Marshall came up with on his own. He invented the procedure of judicial review. And it's been very controversial in American history. It's had a very huge impact on American life. When you think of some of the major social changes we've had, a lot of them have been caused by this type of Supreme Court decision. For example, in 1954, case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, the Supreme Court said that school segregation was unconstitutional, and so the schools eventually had to be integrated. And so that was one use of judicial review. A few years ago, in America, we had another example when the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to pass a law against gay marriage. So in that one decision, they struck down all of the state laws that had banned same-sex marriage up to that point, and they made gay marriage legal throughout the United States. And so basically what you think about judicial review kind of depends on where you're at politically on any given issue. Some people love it, some people hate it. Most people, I think, love it when it goes their way. And that's why judicial review is still a part of American life and probably will never go away. Will be a permanent fixture in the American scene. One of Thomas Jefferson's greatest achievements as president was the massive land deal known as the Louisiana Purchase. How did this come about? Well, you may recall that after the French and Indian War, France had previously owned all of Louisiana, that is, that whole area in green on the map on the western side of the Mississippi River. Had been originally settled by France, but at least parts of it, but they had given it to Spain after the French and Indian War. And so Spain had held it since 1763. But in the year 1800, the new leader of the French people, Napoleon Bonaparte, conquered Spain, and that meant that now France was once again in control of Louisiana. However, Napoleon really did not like the idea of having colonies in America, and that was largely due to the situation in Haiti, where the French controlled Haiti and part of the island of Hispaniola. And the slaves in Haiti, led by General Toussaint Louverture, had been for years waging a very successful slave revolt against the French sugar planters there in Haiti. And eventually, actually, the slaves won and defeated the French and established their own independent republic of Haiti, which still is in existence today. This was the one really successful slave revolt out of all the slave revolts in the history of North and South America. And so Napoleon was very bitter about that, and he just saw colonies as a whole lot of trouble, not really worth it. And so Napoleon in 1803 sent ambassadors to the United States, and he offered Jefferson maybe one of the greatest land deals in all of history. He said he would sell all of Louisiana to the United States for the low price of $15 million. And if you do the math, that comes out to about 3.5 cents per acre of land. Dirt cheap. Now, Jefferson actually hesitated on this, and his reluctance had to do with his opinions about government. And I'm sure you recall that Thomas Jefferson believed in a small federal government. That government is best which governs least, he said. And so, in a way, the Louisiana Purchase kind of went against his beliefs. First of all, he would be increasing the national debt rather than decreasing it. Might have to raise taxes to pay off that debt. Second, it would be making the country bigger. And of course, as a result of that, the government would have to get bigger in order to administer all of that new territory. So Jefferson was getting cold feet. However, eventually he came around and decided that the Louisiana Purchase was the right thing to do. And I think that had to do primarily with another of his deeply cherished beliefs. His belief that farmers were the greatest, the most important people in America. That farmers had those Republican virtues of hard work and thrift and determination and so forth, honesty, etc., that would help the Republic, the American Republic, to survive. And so Jefferson, at the end of the day, just could not turn down this golden opportunity to increase the amount of farmland in the United States, land that he could then sell or give away cheaply to farmers so that agriculture would spread. And in his opinion, that would help to ensure that the United States would continue as a free nation. And so Jefferson said yes. He got Congress to approve the Louisiana Purchase, and overnight, the land area of the United States was approximately doubled. Another reason why Jefferson was interested in Louisiana was that, like Franklin, Jefferson was a multi-talented guy. He was a great intellectual, a writer, and he also dabbled in science. And so he was very interested in biology and botany, the study of plants, and in different cultures. And so he was really itching for the chance to find out more about the animals and the plants and the people, the Indians, who were living in Louisiana. And so in 1804, Jefferson hired two men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to lead an expedition to explore this vast new territory and to bring back information about it to Jefferson. And so this was the famous Lewis and Clark expedition. One of the members of the expedition was Lewis's African-American slave York, who was a key player in everything that happened on the expedition after it left St. Louis on May 14th, 1804. And just to show you on this map the progress of the expedition. So you see that red line. They left St. Louis, sailed on the Missouri River northwest through the Great Plains region, and they made their winter camp in 1804 among the Mandan people, an Indian group. And it was among the Mandan that they got yet another key player in their expedition to join them. That was the Indian woman named Sacagawea. And the reason why they wanted Sacagawea to join them had to do with the fact that she had actually been born farther west, out in that purple area called Oregon country at that time. And she had been sold as a slave as a young girl and had eventually found herself among the Mandan, where she had gotten married to a French fur trader. So what this meant was that Sacagawea knew a lot of languages from not only the Mandans, but from Oregon, where she was born, and the other areas where she had traveled. And so she was really brought onto the expedition as a linguist to help Lewis and Clark communicate with the local Indian peoples, and she did very well with that. Actually, she was a very tough lady too, because she was actually pregnant when the expedition started, and while they were en route, she gave birth to a son who survived and actually had descendants. So there are actually now quite a few people in America who are descended from Sacagawea. Well, anyway, so they made it out to Oregon and spent the winter of 1805, 1806 there, made friends with the local Indians, collected a lot of artifacts, a lot of plants and animal skins and so forth, and then in 1806 made their long way back to St. Louis, and then eventually to Washington, where they presented Jefferson with all of the things that they had collected. And if you visit Jefferson's home, Monticello, near Charlottesville, Virginia today, you can see some of those artifacts on display. So it was, in a way, the first great scientific expedition in American history, the Lewis and Clark expedition. All right, now we come to an episode in Jefferson's life which has gotten a great deal of debate in recent years by historians, and many books and articles have been written, documentaries made about the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and one of his slaves, whose name was Sally Hemings. And the first news of this came out in the newspaper, the Richmond Recorder, on September the 1st, 1802, and the story was actually broken by James Callender. Remember him? He was the one who had first reported on the Hamilton Maria Reynolds sex scandal back in the 1790s. Because at that time Callender had been a Republican, but he had asked Jefferson for a government job. Jefferson had turned him down, and so he had turned against Jefferson. And so in 1802, he came out with these words about Thomas Jefferson in the Richmond Recorder. He said, quote, "It is well known that the man, Jefferson, keeps, and for many years has kept as his concubine, one of his slaves. Her name is Sally. The name of her eldest son is Tom. His features are said to bear a striking, though sable, that means black, resemblance to the president himself," end quote. So in other words, Jefferson was sleeping with Sally Hemings. Concubine means mistress, so he had her as his mistress. She had given birth to a boy named Tom, who looked just like Jefferson, only darker skinned. And, you know, the implication was clear. And again, much ink has been spilled over the years trying to determine if this really happened, if Jefferson really had this ongoing relationship with his African-American slave, Sally Hemings. And it raises a lot of questions about Jefferson because, you know, he was a philosopher. And, you know, one question would be, was he raping her? I mean, obviously these relationships, there was a big power differential between the master and the slave. The master had power over these women. So you could say that there was always that element of sexual abuse or domination there. On the other hand, it might have gone on for many years. She had several children who might have been fathered by Jefferson. And, you know, that raises the issue, was there an emotional relationship between them in some way? Because Jefferson never married again after his wife, Martha, died quite young. Jefferson never married after that, and it's an interesting thing to speculate about. We'll probably never know the whole story for sure because of the lack of records, but here's a few things we do know. One thing that makes the story even stranger, if it's true, was that Sally Hemings was probably Martha Wales, Jefferson's wife's half-sister. Chances are that Martha's father, John Wales, was also Sally Hemings' father. That, again, it happened a lot on the plantation. Masters had absolute power over slave women, and there were many slaves on the plantation who were the children of the masters, actually. Again, it's that crazy, sick logic of slavery. You could end up having your own child as a slave because slavery was passed down through the mother's line. So it didn't matter if your dad was the plantation owner. If your mom was a slave, you were a slave. So anyway, Sally Hemings came to Jefferson's household with Martha Wales, and that means if Sally Hemings was Martha's half-sister, that meant that Jefferson was sleeping with his sister-in-law, if this story is true. Based on the plantation records, we know that Sally Hemings had at least 6 children, and the youngest of her children was named Eston Hemings, a boy born in 1808. And in 1998, scientists collected DNA samples from all the surviving descendants of Eston Hemings, and also all the surviving descendants of Jefferson through his daughter Patsy, and compared them. And what they found out was that Eston Hemings' father had to be a male from the Jefferson family. Now, that did not prove that that Eston's father was, in fact, Thomas Jefferson. It could have been one of Jefferson's close male relatives. However, there is one other factor which makes me think that Thomas Jefferson had to be the father of Sally Hemings' children. And that was the fact that in his will, Jefferson had really intended to free all of his slaves in his will. For example, all of George Washington's slaves had been freed shortly after his death by his wife Martha, and Jefferson really wanted to do all the same thing, but he was so broke at that point in time that he just felt like he couldn't do it. If he freed the slaves, he wouldn't have anything to leave to his daughter, and so he didn't. He only freed in his will 6 of his slaves. 4 of them were the surviving children of Sally Hemings. And that to me suggests that he knew that they were his children and that he couldn't bear the idea of having his children grow up enslaved. Strangely, Jefferson did not free Sally Hemings herself, but after Jefferson's death, his daughter allowed Sally Hemings to essentially stop working and to go and live with her sons, Madison and Eston, and Sally Hemings died in 1835. The subsequent history of the Hemings / Jefferson family is very interesting. In 1850, Eston Hemings moved his family to the then very remote territory of Wisconsin, and he took advantage of that opportunity to change his name to Jefferson, and he and his whole family started to pass as white people. And that's a very interesting question, was that an ethical thing to do, to deny his African American heritage? Well, whether it was ethical or not, it certainly was a step up for his family in terms of worldly success. There were so many opportunities available to whites that were not available to blacks at that time. And so Eston Hemings jumped at that chance. And you can see, kind of how they got away with it, because that picture over on the right is a portrait of Eston Hemings' son, John Wales Jefferson, who served with distinction in the Union Army during the Civil War. And you see that, how easily then he and his family were able to pass as white, and he became a very decorated war hero at a time when there were no black officers in the Union Army. So it's a fascinating story, and I'm happy to report that at the present time, 2020, the black descendants of Thomas Jefferson have formed an organization, and they often will meet with the white descendants organization of Jefferson, and they have been embraced and accepted as fellow members of the family, finally, after all this time. Well, Jefferson was re-elected to a second term in office, but his second administration was not nearly as successful as his first one, and that had to do with the threat of war, this time with Great Britain. Because that war between Great Britain and France and some other countries in Europe was still dragging on. And now the British began to stop American ships and to inspect American cargoes, especially if they were going to France. And if there were any goods that were bound for France, they would be confiscated, so as not to help the French war effort. But the British went one step further. They would inspect all the American sailors, and if there were any of them that they claimed had been born in England, they would essentially kidnap them and force them to join the British Navy. And this procedure was called impressment. Now, of course, American public opinion was outraged by this practice of impressment. And many people began calling on Jefferson to do something about this, especially after an incident in June 1807, when His Majesty's ship, English ship the Leopard, tried to board an American ship, USS Chesapeake, and the captain of the Chesapeake refused to let the British on board, and so the British ship actually opened fire with its cannons on the Chesapeake. Now, this happened in Chesapeake Bay, just a few miles offshore, and people were really furious about this incident. And the call for Jefferson to go to war with Britain became overwhelming. However, as we've said, Jefferson really didn't like the idea of having a big military. He didn't like the idea of going to war. And so he decided to take a different approach, which was basically, he said, look, okay, if you're not going to play nice with us on the high seas, we're just not going to trade with anybody. And it was kind of the, take your ball and go home approach. And so he got Congress to pass a law called the Embargo Act of 1807, which basically said from now on the United States, people in the United States are not allowed to trade with any foreign country. Now, this was really kind of cutting off your nose to spite your face, and you can imagine the instant result for the American economy was total collapse. This created a huge economic downturn. Many people were unemployed, laid off, and the economy essentially went into a free fall, and a great many people were suffering. So when Jefferson left office in 1809, after 2 terms, he was a very unpopular man, and his successor, James Madison, a fellow Republican, knew that he had to do something. And so in 1809, Madison got Congress to repeal the Embargo Act and instead pass a new law saying that we were trading with all countries in the world now except for Great Britain and France. And we would wait and see what would happen with those 2 powers. But in the meantime, we could resume trade with all other countries in the world. And that really did help the economic situation. Meanwhile, I want to talk about some developments and finish up with some developments in Indian country, especially in what present-day Ohio, among the Indian nation known as the Shawnee. And at this time, 2 important leaders emerged who were actually brothers among the Shawnee people, Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh. Now, Tenskwatawa, who you see there in that portrait, was a religious leader who began to have visions from the Great Spirit God, telling him that if the Indian people were going to survive, they had to go back to their roots. They had to stop using American products like guns and kettles and so forth. They had to go back to their original Indian ways, hunt and fight with bows and arrows, and especially they had to stop drinking alcohol, which was being sold to them by unscrupulous American traders, regardless of the terrible impact it was having on Indian groups everywhere. And I should say that Indians really had no tolerance for alcohol. It was not part of their culture before Columbus. And so they really had no, the effect when Indians drank alcohol, you really didn't want to be there, it had a very devastating impact in terms of their behavior, in terms of Indians and their family life and so forth. And so Tenskwatawa was saying, look, we need to get rid of all of these bad habits that we picked up from the Americans, go back to our old traditional ways. And by doing that, we will survive. And this message was strengthened by his brother Tecumseh's actions as one of the most powerful war chiefs of the Shawnee people. So together, Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh began to create a kind of resistance movement. And they began to spread their message to other Indian groups from their headquarters in Prophetstown. You see there near the center of this map there on the Tippecanoe River. In present-day Indiana, Tenskwatawa established that as his headquarters. And so you could see why these leaders were concerned. From this map, all of the colored areas that have dates on them represent regions of land that had been taken over by the United States in various land deals. And so you see that the Indian homeland was shrinking, and pretty soon it looked like the Indians were going to be deprived of all their land, and so the Shawnee wanted to fight back. However, needless to say, the American officials in this area were very alarmed by what was going on among the Shawnee, especially Indiana's territorial governor, William Henry Harrison, who would later become president very briefly. Harrison got together an army and he attacked Prophetstown, and he defeated Tenskwatawa and destroyed that village. And so, because Prophetstown was located on the Tippecanoe River, ever afterward, Harrison was known as Old Tippecanoe, which he would use as his slogan, or part of his slogan in the presidential election. One of the reasons why Harrison was able to defeat the Shawnee at Prophetstown was that Tecumseh, at that point in time, was actually far away, actually in the deep south, among the Creek Indians of western Georgia, Alabama. And Tecumseh had gone down to Creek country, going around telling people about this new resistance program, and inviting the Creeks to join him and to smoke the war pipe with him. In other words, to go to war against the Americans and to defend their own Indian traditions. Now, that put the Creeks in kind of a dilemma, because a lot of the Creeks had actually started to Americanize pretty rapidly. The Creeks were considered by the Americans to be one of the, quote, 5 civilized tribes, along with the Cherokee, who we'll talk about quite a bit very soon in the course. And so they had essentially adopted a lot of American laws, especially laws about property. And they had begun to have private property, individual ownership of land. This was not the way that Indian tribes usually did things. I think I've said before that normally in Indian groups, all land was owned collectively by the whole tribe. But individual Indians now started to acquire farms, their own property, their own land. And at first, it was the women among the Creeks who began planting and harvesting cotton and making cloth out of it, because in Indian culture, women were the farmers, men were the hunters and the gatherers. But that wasn't good enough for the United States government and their agents that they were sending to the Creeks, like Benjamin Hawkins there in the picture, because the U.S. government really wanted the Indian men to settle down and start farming, thinking that that would help get them off the warpath, and so they would become less warlike and more peaceful. But the Creek men refused to do that. Again, it was unmanly in their culture for men to do farm work. And so the only way that Creek men would become farmers was if they owned slaves who could do the work for them. And so actually, Creek farmers began to establish really the first slave plantations in Alabama, and later the Chickasaw and the Choctaw would do this in Mississippi. It's very interesting that one oppressed group, the Indians, began to oppress African Americans by buying them as slaves and forcing them to work on their land. But that was, again, because of the Indian culture, which said that it was shameful for a Creek warrior to work as a farmer. All right, so when the War of 1812 finally broke out, a lot of it had to do with resistance by Indians to the U.S. government, kind of dovetailing with this movement by Tecumseh that was going on at the time. How did the war actually start? Well, there was a group of young congressmen led by such figures as Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, who put tremendous pressure on President Madison to go to war with England. And finally, Madison caved, and in June 1812, Congress declared war on Great Britain. this group in Congress that really wanted the war were called the War Hawks. Um, but it's interesting that in a lot of the frontier areas of the United States, the war was actually more between Indians and the U.S. government. So, for example, um, in southern Georgia and in Florida, the War of 1812 is called Payne's War because there was an American military leader named Payne who got an army together and invaded Florida, which was still owned by Spain at this time. And he met with very stiff resistance from the Seminole Indians in Florida, who actually had a large element of African American heritage in their tribe. Because remember all of those slaves who had escaped to Florida back during the colonial period at the invitation of the King of Spain, who said they could come there and serve in his army and be free? Well, their descendants were still there in Florida, but they had a lot of them had ended up joining the Seminole tribe, and we have just very tantalizing evidence about this. You see there in the picture, this was an engraving of one of the Seminole leaders who seems to have some African American ancestry based on this image. And so we know that there were these black Seminoles who were in a sense also fighting for their freedom because they knew that if the US took over Florida that they might be forced back into slavery, and they didn't want that. So Tecumseh of course joined forces with the British Army. And in fact, Tecumseh was killed in Canada, fighting near present-day Toronto, Canada, in October 1813 on the British side. In the Creek country, which he had been trying to get to join his cause, some of the Creeks listened and actually split off from the main two tribes of the Lower and Upper Creeks and started calling themselves the Red Sticks. And so these Red Stick rebel Creeks went to war against the United States in 1813. And that resistance lasted for about a year until a young colonel from Tennessee named Andrew Jackson led an army down to Horseshoe Bend, Alabama, in eastern Alabama, and fought a battle there against the Red Stick Creeks and defeated them in March 1814, Jackson's first great military victory. And so that put an end to the Red Stick War, but as late as July 1816, there was still a fort in Florida that became known as the Negro Fort at Prospect Bluff, Florida, because it was largely staffed by these black Seminoles. And they were still getting British support and weapons up to July 1816 and still holding out in resistance until finally the U.S. government attacked and destroyed the Negro Fort in July 1816. But it's interesting that the War of 1812 in many ways was a fight for freedom and an example of Indian and African American resistance. Now, how did the rest of the war turn out between the U.S. and England? Well, I'm afraid that's going to be another cliffhanger. You'll get the full story on that in the next video lecture.